The hydraulic system kicked in at exactly 2:47 a.m. on February 16, 2014, and the bathtub in the modest Culiacan house began to rise from its tiled frame. Beneath it, a steep staircase descended into darkness. Joaquin Guzman Loera, the man the world knew as El Chapo, scrambled down those steps wearing nothing but his underwear. His mistress Lucero Sanchez Lopez right behind him. Above them, Mexican Marines hammered a battering ram against the front door, again and again, the steel-reinforced entrance refusing to budge. The door had been custom-made, filled with water between layers of steel, so that the heat from the impacts wouldn't spread and weaken the metal. It would take those Marines 10 full minutes to break through. By then, Chapo would be more than a mile away, running through the sewers beneath the city, splashing through shallow, filthy water in a cylindrical passage less than 5 feet high. This wasn't just another safe house in his network. This was one of 7 properties he owned in Culiacan, all connected by an elaborate underground tunnel system that stretched through the municipal sewer infrastructure like a secret subway built for one man. The house on Rio Humaya Street had cost maybe $130,000. Pocket change for a man worth $12.6 billion, according to the United States Department of Justice. But Chapo hadn't bought it for luxury. He'd bought it because a storm drain ran directly beneath the foundation, and because his architect could dig a tunnel that would save his life. What the Marines didn't know that morning, what nobody except Chapo's closest associates understood, was that this house represented just a tiny fraction of a property empire that spanned not just Mexico, but reached deep into South America. While authorities in the United States and Mexico had spent years tracking his movements through Sinaloa, while they'd identified his ranches in the Sierra Madre Mountains and his beach houses along the Pacific coast, while they documented his mansions in Guadalajara and his condos in resort towns, they'd missed something enormous. In Colombia, the country that supplied the cocaine that made Chapo the most powerful drug trafficker on earth, he'd quietly accumulated 78 properties. 78 mansions, hotels, offices, farms, and buildings scattered across 9 Colombian cities: Cali, Palmira, Jamundi, El Cerrito, Buga la Grande, La Cumbre, Valle del Cauca, Puerto Boyacá, and Bogotá. These weren't listed under his name. They were registered to frontmen, hidden behind shell companies, purchased through intermediaries who would never admit they worked for the Mexican kingpin. But they were his, bought with billions of dollars earned from moving cocaine from Colombian jungles to American cities. Property after property acquired during the years when he transformed from a poor farm boy who couldn't read into the most wanted fugitive on the planet. The story of how Chapo came to own 78 properties in Colombia begins not in the mountains of Sinaloa, where he was born on April 4, 1957, but in the relationships he built with the men who controlled South America's cocaine production. Joaquin Guzman grew up in La Tuna, a village so remote and primitive that children left school by 3rd grade to work in the fields. His father grew marijuana and opium, subsistence farming supplemented by drug crops that barely kept the family fed. Young Chapo was illiterate, short, and poor, but he was clever, and he understood one fundamental truth. The real money wasn't in growing drugs, but in moving them. By the 1970s, he'd become an apprentice to 2 of Mexico's most powerful traffickers. The first was Amado Carrillo Fuentes, who owned a fleet of airplanes and earned the nickname Lord of the Skies. The second was Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, a former police officer who ran the Guadalajara Cartel and was known as El Padrino, the Godfather. These men taught Chapo the fundamentals of the cocaine business, and the most important lesson was this: Colombia grows it, Mexico moves it, and America buys it. In the early 1980s, when Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel dominated the cocaine trade, they needed Mexican smugglers to get their product across the United States border. Chapo started as what one law enforcement official later described as an air traffic controller, coordinating flights of cocaine from Colombia to Mexico. But coordination meant relationships, and relationships meant trips to Colombia. And trips to Colombia meant meeting the men who ran the cocaine laboratories in the jungles and the processing facilities in the cities. Chapo traveled to Medellin, to Cali, to Barranquilla. He met with members of the Cifuentes Villa family, a Colombian crime dynasty that would become his most important South American connection. He negotiated with producers. He inspected processing facilities. He arranged payments and shipments. And somewhere during those years of constant travel back and forth across the continent, he started buying property. A farm here, an office building there, a hotel in one city, a mansion in another. These properties served multiple purposes. They were investments, a way to launder drug money into legitimate real estate. They were safe houses, places he could stay during his frequent Colombian visits without drawing attention. They were storage facilities for cash and cocaine. They were status symbols in the cities where Colombian drug lords would respect a Mexican who owned premium real estate. And they were leverage, physical proof that Chapo was committed to Colombia, that he had skin in the game, that he could be trusted with bigger shipments and better prices. By the 1990s, when Chapo had risen to control significant smuggling routes through Baja California and was challenging the Tijuana cartel for dominance, his Colombian properties had multiplied. Journalist Malcolm Beath, who wrote The Last Narco El Chapo, documented that Chapo owned mansions, offices, buildings, hotels, and farms scattered throughout Colombia. General Oscar Naranjo, who directed Colombia's national police during those years, confirmed to investigators that they had evidence of Mexicans connected to Chapo settled in Medellin, Cali, Pereira, and Barranquilla. Some properties were in remote rural areas, hidden farms where cocaine could be processed or stored before shipment. Others were in major cities, legitimate-looking buildings that blended into commercial districts. The scale of this Colombian empire remained largely hidden from international law enforcement because the properties weren't registered to Joaquin Guzman. They were held by Colombian associates, by members of the Cifuentes Villa family who acted as his partners and proxies, by corrupt businessmen who accepted payment to hold titles in their names. When Mexican or American authorities traced Chapo's wealth, they focused on what they could see. The obvious properties in Sinaloa, the ranch near his home village, the beach houses he visited with his rotating cast of mistresses. They missed the 78 Colombian properties because Chapo had learned a crucial lesson that would protect him for decades. If nobody knows you own it, nobody can take it away. The sophistication of Chapo's property strategy in Mexico would eventually dwarf even his Colombian holdings in terms of sheer criminal ingenuity. While the Colombian properties represented wealth and strategic positioning, his Mexican safe houses represented survival. Consider what happened in Culiacan, the capital city of Sinaloa State, where Chapo owned not one but 7 properties connected by underground tunnels. These weren't adjacent houses. They were scattered across different neighborhoods, each one appearing to be an ordinary middle-class home with barred windows and modest furnishings. But beneath each house, hidden under bathtubs fitted with hydraulic lifts, were entrances to a tunnel network that ran for more than a mile through the municipal sewer system. The tunnels had been dug over a period of 7 weeks by workers who operated only at night, removing dirt bucket by bucket to avoid detection. The passages featured electric lighting, ventilation systems, and wooden boards laid along the floors to make movement easier. The bathtub escape hatches were masterpieces of engineering. An electrical outlet by the bathroom sink, combined with a hidden switch on the side of the vanity mirror, activated hydraulic lifts that raised the entire tub at a 45-degree angle in less than 10 seconds. The caulk around the rim of each tub was designed to break cleanly when the hydraulics engaged, then could be resealed afterward to hide any evidence of the hatch. Even Chapo's bodyguards didn't always know which houses had these hidden exits, a security measure that meant he could surprise even his own men. The house on Rio Humaya Street, where the Marines almost caught him that February morning, was typical of Chapo's approach to property. From the outside, nothing about it suggested wealth or importance. It sat in the Libertad neighborhood, which ironically means freedom in Spanish, a middle-class area where a cream-colored two-story house with barred windows didn't attract attention. Inside, however, the property revealed its true purpose. Surveillance cameras covered every angle of the exterior, feeding images to monitors in multiple rooms. The front door, which looked like ordinary wood from the street, was actually a submarine-style airlock made of steel and filled with water. The bathtub in the ground-floor bathroom sat on hydraulic lifts connected to a 45-degree angled staircase that led down to the sewers. The entire property had been designed not for comfort, but for escape. Every feature calculated to buy Chapo an extra 30 seconds or an extra minute when the authorities finally found him. And find him, they did, again and again, only to watch him vanish through those tunnels while they battered at doors that refused to break. The network of 7 connected houses in Culiacan represented years of planning and probably hundreds of thousands of dollars in construction costs, though the exact amount was never disclosed. But that investment paid for itself the morning of February 16th. When those tunnels gave Chapo the head start, he needed to reach a storm drain by the Humaya River, more than a mile from where he'd started. The Marines who pursued him through the sewers that morning, splashing through filthy water in near total darkness, following the tactical vest he'd shed in his desperation to move faster, emerged at the river to find nothing. Chapo had been picked up by Manuel Lopez Osorio, a former Mexican Special Forces officer who'd switched sides to work for the cartel and went by the nickname El Picudo, Pointy Nose. Picudo drove Chapo and his bodyguard, Carlos Hu Ramirez, known as El Condor, south of Culiacan, where they met another aide and switched vehicles. By the time the Marines realized their quarry had escaped, Chapo was already planning his next move, rotating to another property, another identity, another temporary refuge in the endless game of hide-and-seek that had defined his life since his prison escape in 2001. What Chapo owned in Mexico extended far beyond those 7 connected houses in Culiacan. During his trial in Brooklyn in 2018 and 2019, one of his former top associates, Miguel Angel Martinez, testified about the scope of Chapo's property empire. Martinez had been a close friend and lieutenant who'd worked directly with Chapo for years, and his testimony painted a picture of almost incomprehensible wealth. He told the jury that by the 1990s, Chapo had 4 private jets, not for flying himself around, but primarily for transporting the enormous amounts of cash his American distributors sent back to Mexico. He testified that Chapo had houses at every single beach in Mexico and ranches in every single state, all 32 of them. This wasn't metaphorical. This was literal. A house at every major beach meant properties in Cancun, Puerto Vallarta, Acapulco, Mazatlan, Cabo San Lucas, Playa del Carmen, and dozens of smaller coastal towns. A ranch in every state meant properties from Baja California in the northwest to Quintana Roo in the southeast, from Chihuahua in the north to Chiapas in the south, from Tamaulipas on the Gulf Coast to Jalisco on the Pacific. The maintenance costs alone must have been staggering. The monthly electricity bill for just one of Chapo's properties reportedly reached $47,000, and that was for a house he barely used. Among all these properties, one stood out for its sheer extravagance: the $10 million beach house in Acapulco. This wasn't just a mansion. This was a compound, a statement of wealth so ostentatious that even other drug lords must have been impressed. The property featured a private zoo where tigers, lions, panthers, and deer roamed enclosures large enough that Chapo toured them in what witnesses described as a little train. He would ride through his zoo, viewing his collection of exotic animals like some twisted version of a Mexican Citizen Kane. The farm boy from La Tuna, who now owned creatures more valuable than everything his father had ever possessed. The Acapulco house also had direct access to the Pacific Ocean and its own yacht, which Chapo had named Chapito, Little Chapo, a term of endearment that his associates used for him. The yacht matched a fleet of vehicles and toys that included jet skis, luxury cars, and enough recreational equipment to stock a resort. The property employed dozens of staff members, groundskeepers, security guards, housekeepers, cooks, and handlers for the zoo animals. The monthly operating costs likely exceeded what most Mexican families earned in a year. But for Chapo, whose Sinaloa Cartel was generating billions of dollars in revenue, a $10 million beach house with a private zoo was just another way to enjoy the fruits of an empire built on cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and marijuana. Yet, for all his wealth and all his properties, Chapo lived most of his life on the run, rotating between safe houses, never staying in one place long enough to feel settled. His lifestyle was a strange contradiction. He could afford anything, but couldn't enjoy it. He owned ranches in every state, but spent years hiding in the mountains. He had houses at every beach, but rarely spent more than a night or two at any of them. A former Drug Enforcement Administration agent named Mike Vigil, who'd pursued Chapo in Mexico for years, summed up this contradiction perfectly. He told reporters that here's a guy who's made hundreds of millions of dollars in the drug trade, and he's living like a pauper up in the mountains. Chapo likes the fiestas, Vigil said. He likes the music. He likes to dance. But until his later years, discipline and paranoia kept him isolated in the Sierra Madre, where the rugged terrain and loyal locals made him nearly impossible to catch. The mountains were his fortress. He could move between ranches, traveling on dirt roads and mountain tracks where armored convoys couldn't follow, and helicopters could be heard miles away. Locals warned him when strangers arrived. His network of lookouts, paid and voluntary, created a surveillance system that no government could match. But sometime around 2012, Chapo started taking risks. He was in his mid-50s, married to Emma Coronel Aispuro, a woman 30 years younger than him, whom he'd married in 2007 when she was just 18 years old, a former beauty queen from a drug trafficking family. They had twin daughters, Mali and Maria Joaquina, born around 2012, and Emma made it clear that she expected her husband to be present in their lives. She wasn't a mountain person, according to law enforcement officials who monitored the family. She wanted to live in cities, to enjoy the wealth that Chapo's empire provided, to give her daughters a life that looked normal, even if their father was the most wanted man in Mexico. Chapo, perhaps tired of mountain life, perhaps overconfident after eluding capture for 13 years since his prison escape, perhaps simply in love with his young wife and determined to make her happy, began spending more time in Culiacan and other cities. He started visiting high-end restaurants, arranging for his gunmen to politely confiscate the cell phones of other diners before he arrived, feasting on gourmet food, picking up everyone's check, and then disappearing into the night with the phones returned and apologies offered for the inconvenience. These restaurant visits became his signature, a touch of style that reinforced his Robin Hood image among people who saw him as a generous outlaw rather than a violent criminal. Chapo's restaurant etiquette, however charmingly portrayed in the narco corridos that celebrated his legend, was built on a foundation of corruption and violence that extended across Mexico and deep into Colombia. The 78 Colombian properties that he'd accumulated over decades represented more than just real estate. They represented relationships with the most dangerous criminal organizations in South America. His closest Colombian connection was the Cifuentes Villa family, a dynasty of traffickers who'd been in the cocaine business for generations. Alex Cifuentes Villa, who would eventually become Chapo's right-hand man and live with him for years, came from this family. Alex's brother Jorge Milton Cifuentes Villa also worked directly with Chapo, helping coordinate cocaine shipments from Colombian producers through Mexican smuggling routes to American distributors. During Chapo's trial, both brothers testified against him, and their testimony revealed the depth of his Colombian network. Alex Cifuentes testified that he'd started helping his father dry and pack cocaine when he was 10 years old. He'd befriended top aides to Pablo Escobar. He'd grown up in the Colombian cocaine trade and brought that expertise to his partnership with Chapo. The relationship gave Chapo access to the best cocaine at the best prices, allowing him to undercut competitors and dominate smuggling routes. In exchange, the Cifuentes family gained a reliable partner who could move massive quantities of cocaine into the United States without the Colombian suppliers having to worry about Mexican middlemen cheating them or Mexican authorities seizing their product. The properties Chapo owned in Colombia served this relationship. A farm in Valle del Cauca could store cocaine waiting for transport. An office building in Cali could host meetings between Mexican and Colombian traffickers. A hotel in Bogotá could launder money through room rentals and restaurant receipts. A mansion in Jamundí could house Chapo during his frequent visits to inspect product and negotiate deals. These properties blended into their surroundings. They didn't advertise themselves as cartel assets. They operated as legitimate businesses or private residences, paying taxes, employing local workers, contributing to the Colombian economy in ways that made them nearly invisible to law enforcement. Even when Colombian authorities suspected that certain properties might be connected to drug trafficking, proving ownership was almost impossible. The titles were held by Colombian citizens with no obvious connection to Chapo. The properties were purchased with money that had been laundered through so many transactions that tracing it back to drug proceeds would take years of investigation. By the time Colombian police obtained warrants to seize a property, Chapo had usually sold it and bought another one, staying several moves ahead of investigators who were already overwhelmed trying to combat local drug trafficking. The scale of wealth that Chapo controlled, including his 78 Colombian properties and his properties across Mexico, became more clear during his trial when witnesses described his lifestyle in detail. Miguel Angel Martinez testified about the Acapulco Zoo, where big cats roamed and Chapo toured in his little train. He described how Chapo used his 4 private jets not just for personal travel, but primarily as flying banks, ferrying hundreds of millions of dollars in cash from the United States back to Mexico. One jet might carry as much as $10 or $15 million per flight, stacks of $100 bills stuffed into duffel bags and suitcases. The proceeds from cocaine and heroin sales in cities across America. The jets would land at private airstrips on ranches Chapo owned. The money would be unloaded and either hidden or laundered through legitimate businesses, and the jets would fly back for another load. Martinez testified that in the 1990s, Chapo already had 4 jets, houses at every single beach, and a ranch in every single state. And this was before he'd even reached the peak of his power. By the 2000s, when the Sinaloa Cartel had expanded operations to more than 50 countries and Chapo was generating billions of dollars per year in revenue, his property empire had grown to include not just the Mexican ranches and beach houses and the Colombian properties, but also real estate in other South American countries, assets in Central America, and investments in Asia and Europe. The human cost of this empire, The violence and corruption required to build and maintain it played out most dramatically in Mexico, where Chapo waged brutal turf wars with rival cartels. One of the most horrific incidents occurred in November 1992, when Chapo's henchmen massacred 6 people at a crowded discotheque in Puerto Vallarta. They cut the telephone lines first so nobody could call for help, then walked inside and opened fire on the dance floor. The targets were Tijuana-based traffickers whom Chapo was challenging for control of smuggling routes through Baja California. The targets survived by hiding in the bathroom, but 6 innocent people died in the crossfire. The next spring, in 1993, Tijuana Cartel hitmen tried to assassinate Chapo at the Guadalajara airport. Gunfire erupted across the terminal. Chapo scrambled out of his vehicle and crawled to safety. 7 people died, including Archbishop Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo, apparently mistaken for Chapo by the gunman. The Archbishop's murder caused a national scandal in Mexico. The government, which had largely tolerated drug trafficking as long as it stayed relatively quiet, could no longer ignore Chapo. He was arrested in Guatemala a few months later and extradited to Mexico to serve a 20-year sentence for conspiracy, drug trafficking, and bribery. But even in Puente Grande maximum security prison in Jalisco, Chapo continued to build his empire. He bought off guards and administrators, enjoyed visits from prostitutes, held parties for favored inmates that featured alcohol, lobster bisque, and filet mignon. He conducted business by cell phone, giving orders to his Sinaloa Cartel lieutenants, who continued trafficking drugs while their boss sat in a cell that was really more of an office. Psychological interviews conducted by Mexican authorities during his imprisonment noted that Chapo was egocentric, narcissistic, shrewd, persistent, tenacious, meticulous, discriminating, and secretive. That profile proved accurate on January 1st, 2001, when Chapo escaped from Puente Grande. The official story claimed he hid in a laundry cart pushed by a paid accomplice. Most Mexicans believe Chapo simply walked out the front door of a prison he controlled so completely that security was a joke. Criminal charges were eventually brought against 71 people who worked at the prison, including the warden. All of them accused of taking bribes from Chapo or facilitating his escape. The message was clear. In Mexico, with enough money, anything was possible. For the next 13 years, Chapo remained free, expanding his operations, consolidating power, and rotating between the properties he owned across Mexico and South America. His network of safe houses in Culiacan became increasingly sophisticated. He commissioned those 7 connected houses with their hydraulic bathtub escape hatches and their tunnels through the sewers. He developed the mirror communication system that made him nearly impossible to track electronically. The mirror system worked like this. If you needed to communicate with Chapo, you would send a BlackBerry message to a trusted lieutenant who spent his days in Starbucks coffee shops and other locations with public Wi-Fi. That lieutenant would transcribe your message onto an iPad and forward it using Wi-Fi, avoiding the cellular networks that authorities monitored. The message would go not directly to Chapo, but to a second intermediary who would transcribe it onto his BlackBerry and relay it to Chapo. When Chapo replied, his answer traveled back through the same 2-step process. This system, combined with Chapo's habit of rarely staying in one place for more than a night or two, made him nearly invisible to the DEA agents and Mexican Marines who hunted him. But the mirror system and the tunnel network and the bribes and the lookouts couldn't protect Chapo from the mistakes that accumulate over years of running a criminal empire. In December 2013, Jose Rodrigo Arechiga, known as El Chino Antrax, the chief enforcer for the Sinaloa Cartel, was arrested at Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport on an Interpol Red notice. In November, the 23-year-old son of one of Chapo's closest associates had been arrested trying to cross the border at Nogales. In December, Mexican troops in a helicopter shot and killed another key cartel enforcer. These losses forced the cartel to regroup, and regrouping meant phone calls and emails among the leadership. The DEA intercepted scores of communications as the cartel attempted to reorganize. Those intercepts led to intelligence that Chapo would be coming to Culiacan in mid-February 2014 for a meeting with his sons Alfredo and Ivan. The DEA presented this intelligence to Mexican authorities, and a special forces unit of Marines began assembling near Los Cabos. Their code name for the mission was Operation Gargoyle. Their objective was to capture the most wanted man in Mexico. The Marines, who'd seen intense combat battling the Zetas cartel in northeast Mexico and had a reputation for shooting first and asking questions later, operated with extreme secrecy. They wore black masks over their faces whenever photographed. They surrendered their cell phones days before operations to prevent leaks. None of them knew their target or destination until they boarded helicopters for the mission. This operational security was necessary because Chapo's intelligence network was legendary. A former bodyguard for the governor of Sinaloa released YouTube videos claiming he'd accompanied the governor on a trip to meet with Chapo, and that the governor had instructed his subordinates not to antagonize the Sinaloa Cartel, but to crack down on its rivals instead. The bodyguard was later found decapitated beside a road. That's how Chapo maintained control. He bought off officials at every level, from municipal police to governors, and those who couldn't be bought were intimidated or killed. But the Marines couldn't be bought. At least not the unit pursuing Chapo, and they were too disciplined to be intimidated. The first major arrest of Operation Gargoyle came on February 13, 2014. When Marines apprehended a group of Sinaloa assassins on a highway outside Culiacan. The Marines confiscated phones from the arrested men and sent them for analysis. Those phones led them to Mario Hidalgo Arguello, nicknamed El Nariz, the Nose, a former Mexican Special Forces officer who'd switched sides to work as Chapo's personal assistant and errand boy. Nariz was part of Chapo's inner circle, one of the few people who knew where Chapo slept on any given night. Though even Nariz usually didn't know until they were en route to the next safe house. On the night of February 16th, past midnight, Chapo sent Nariz out to pick up takeout food. Chapo had become largely nocturnal, sleeping during the day and eating dinner very late. That night, he was staying at the house on Rio Humaya Street that belonged to his ex-wife Griselda Lopez, one of his rotating properties in the seven-house network. Nariz left to get the food, returned to his own house, and found Marines waiting for him. Under questioning, Nariz flipped immediately. He admitted Chapo was hiding in the city and gave the address. Just before dawn, the Marines arrived at the cream-colored two-story house in the Libertad neighborhood and began their 10-minute battle with a door that refused to break. By the time the Marines finally breached that door and streamed through the modest kitchen into the series of windowless rooms with surveillance cameras everywhere, Chapo had been running for more than 10 minutes. He had a significant head start on the Marines, who followed him into the sewers. In the streets above, dozens of troops were in position, ready to pursue him when he emerged. In the sky, a covert U.S. drone looked down on the city, poised to track him through the streets. But Chapo ran through those tunnels as if he'd rehearsed this escape, which he probably had. The passage was dark and tight and filled with shallow water, but he splashed through it at high speed, shedding his tactical vest when it slowed him down, the Marines behind him unable to close the gap. At one point the tunnel forked and the Marines momentarily lost the trail, until they spotted the discarded vest and charged onward in that direction. Eventually the Marines emerged at a storm drain by the Humaya River, more than a mile from the starting point. Chapo was gone, Picked up by Picudo, driven south, switched to another vehicle, vanished once again into the vast network of safe houses and loyal supporters and corrupt officials who made him impossible to hold. 2 days after the escape, President Obama visited Mexico City and held a press conference with President Enrique Peña Nieto, where he praised the excellent cooperation between the United States and Mexico on criminal justice issues. Behind the scenes, the Marines and their American advisors were furious. They'd come so close to capturing Chapo only to watch him slip away again. But they didn't give up. They occupied the house on Rio Humaya Street and discovered it was connected through the sewers to 6 other houses, each with its own bathtub escape hatch. They raided a nearby warehouse and found more than 3 tons of cocaine and methamphetamine, along with heavy weapons. Some of the drugs had been concealed inside plastic cucumbers and bananas in preparation for smuggling across the border. The Marines arrested Manuel Lopez Osorio, El Picudo, who'd driven Chapo to safety. Picudo, like Naris before him, cooperated under questioning. He told the Marines that the bodyguard who'd fled through the tunnel with Chapo was Carlos Hu Ramirez, El Condor, Chapo's most trusted employee. The Marines raided Condor's house in Culiacan and found it empty, his BlackBerry turned off. Then, on February 20th, the device came to life. Condor was sending a text, and the signal came from Mazatlan, a beach resort city 140 miles southeast of Culiacan. The Marines worried that Chapo might have already left Mazatlan for the safety of the Sierra Madre. But Condor's communication suggested that maybe, just maybe, Chapo was still on the coast. On the night of Friday, February 21st, about 40 Marines assembled in Mazatlan, along with a small contingent of American agents from the DEA, the U.S. Marshals, and the Department of Homeland Security. The Marshals traced Condor's BlackBerry signal to the Hotel Miramar, a white 12-story condominium building with 3 columns of half-moon balconies overlooking the Pacific. Geolocation technology could identify the building, but not the specific apartment, so the Marines formed a perimeter and consulted the hotel registry. 2 apartments had been rented the previous day. In the early hours of Saturday morning, a team of Marines burst into one apartment and discovered 2 groggy tourists recovering from an evening of partying. One of them, an American, thought they'd been raided for smoking marijuana and produced a California medical marijuana card from his wallet. The Marines were perplexed. On the 4th floor, another team of 6 Marines approached apartment 401. They found Condor standing guard with an assault rifle. He raised his weapon for only a moment before realizing he was outnumbered. The Marines crashed through a flimsy wooden door, shouting their arrival. Inside the 2-bedroom apartment with its potted plants, cheap furniture, and white tile floor, they found 2 women in one bedroom, Chapo's personal chef and a nanny sleeping with his 2-year-old twin daughters, Mali and Maria Joaquina. A pink pack and play matched the girls' miniature pink suitcases. The Marines raced to the master bedroom, where they discovered Emma Coronel, who'd been sleeping. She shrieked, "Don't kill him! Don't kill him! He's the father of my children!" Chapo had scrambled out of bed in his underwear, grabbed an assault rifle, and darted into a small bathroom. The standoff lasted only seconds. Emma Coronel screaming, the Marines bellowing, and then Chapo shouting, "Okay. Okay, okay, okay," extending his empty hands through the bathroom doorway in surrender. Less than 3 minutes after the Marines stormed the apartment, Joaquin Guzman Loera, El Chapo, the world's most powerful drug trafficker, was in custody. He'd entered the Hotel Miramar, pretending to be a frail old man in a blue vinyl wheelchair. He exited it in handcuffs, wearing black jeans and a white shirt, his face bruised, flanked by Marines in black masks. The capture set off celebrations in Washington and Mexico City, where politicians praised the excellent cooperation between the two countries and promised that Chapo would finally face justice. But Chapo had escaped from Mexican custody before, and many observers doubted that any Mexican prison could hold him. Those doubts proved justified 18 months later when Chapo escaped from Altiplano maximum security prison through a tunnel that stretched more than a mile from his cell to an abandoned house. A tunnel equipped with lighting, ventilation, and a rail system with a motorcycle adapted to run on the tracks. His second escape made international headlines and embarrassed the Mexican government. For months, Chapo remained free, moving between safe houses, presumably including some of those properties in Colombia where Mexican authorities had limited reach. But his freedom depended on staying hidden, and Chapo made a critical mistake. He agreed to meet with American actor Sean Penn and Mexican actress Kate del Castillo to discuss a movie about his life. The October 2015 meeting between Chapo and the actors took place at a remote location in Mexico. Mexican intelligence agents photographed the gathering and used the intelligence to narrow their search. When Chapo was finally tracked to a house in Los Mochis in January 2016, the Marines who raided the property triggered a gun battle that killed 5 of Chapo's bodyguards. Chapo and Condor fled through another tunnel and emerged from a manhole cover in the street. They were captured while trying to escape on the highway out of town. This time, Mexican authorities took no chances. On January 19, 2017, Chapo was extradited to the United States, flown in a military plane to New York, where he was transferred to a federal detention center to await trial. A year later, his trial began in a Brooklyn courtroom, and over 3 months, witnesses painted a detailed portrait of his criminal empire. The testimony about Chapo's properties came from multiple witnesses, each offering glimpses of his vast holdings. Miguel Angel Martinez described the 4 jets, the houses at every beach, the ranches in every state, the $10 million Acapulco property with its zoo and little train. Alex Cifuentes Villa described living with Chapo for years, moving between safe houses, coordinating cocaine shipments from Colombia. Lucero Guadalupe Sanchez Lopez, the former state legislator who'd been Chapo's mistress for 3 years, described the February 2014 escape through the bathtub tunnel, how she'd fled naked with a naked Chapo through the sewers of Culiacan. Her testimony was particularly dramatic because Emma Coronel sat in the courtroom, watching, laughing at times while her husband's mistress cried on the stand. Sanchez testified that she'd thought she and Chapo had a romantic relationship, that she'd bought hundreds of kilos of marijuana for him, that she'd acted as his wife, all without ever being paid. Until this day, she said, I'm confused because I thought we were in a romantic relationship. The courtroom drama offered a window into Chapo's personal life, the multiple women he juggled, the families he maintained in different cities, the emotional chaos that surrounded him even as he managed a multi-billion-dollar criminal enterprise. But the most significant testimony regarding Chapo's properties came when prosecutors presented evidence about his Colombian holdings. The 78 properties that Chapo owned across Colombia had been largely unknown to American authorities until the trial revealed the scope of his South American investments. Witnesses described how Chapo traveled constantly to Colombia during the 80s and 90s, how he bought properties through frontmen and shell companies, how those properties served as meeting places and storage facilities and safe houses during his frequent visits. In 2009, Colombian authorities seized more than $50 million worth of properties linked to Chapo and the Cifuentes Villa family. The seizures came after a massive investigation by the Colombian National Police into the Sinaloa Cartel's operations in Colombia, an investigation that revealed Chapo's properties in Cali, Palmira, Yamundi, El Cerrito, Bugalagrande, La Cumbre, Valle del Cauca, Puerto Boyacá, and Bogotá. These weren't small holdings. These were mansions, hotels, office buildings, farms, and estates. Properties that represented hundreds of millions of dollars in total value, real estate that had appreciated over the decades since Chapo first began buying Colombian property in the 1980s. The trial also revealed the methods Chapo used to hide his Colombian properties. Witnesses testified that properties were registered to members of the Cifuentes Villa family, to Colombian business associates, to corrupt officials who accepted payment for holding titles in their names. The Sinaloa Cartel maintained corporate networks in Colombia. Shell companies that purchased properties, held them for years, then sold them and purchased others, constantly rotating assets to stay ahead of investigators. This strategy worked because Colombian authorities, already overwhelmed with combating local drug trafficking, couldn't track property transactions that appeared legitimate on paper. A farm purchased by a Colombian citizen with money from a Colombian bank didn't trigger any alarms, even if the real owner was a Mexican drug lord and the money had been laundered through dozens of transactions. By the time investigators suspected a property might be connected to Chapo, he'd often sold it and bought another one, always moving, always ahead of the law. On February 12, 2019, after a trial that lasted nearly 3 months and featured testimony from 56 witnesses, a federal jury in Brooklyn found Joaquin Guzman Loera guilty on all 10 counts, including engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise, drug trafficking, money laundering, and firearms offenses. On July 17, 2019, Judge Brian Cogan sentenced Chapo to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 30 years, and ordered him to forfeit $12.6 billion. Prosecutors called that figure a conservative estimate of the cash generated by Chapo's drug empire over 3 decades. The reality, as Mexico's Attorney General Raul Cervantes acknowledged, was that U.S. authorities had not found not even $1 of Chapo's assets. The money, like the properties, was hidden behind shell companies and frontmen, laundered through legitimate businesses, scattered across banks in countries with strong privacy laws. Chapo's 78 Colombian properties had been seized by the Colombian government, but their value represented a tiny fraction of his total wealth. His Mexican properties, including the 7 connected houses in Culiacan, were auctioned off or raffled away by the Mexican government in a national lottery. On September 15, 2021, the Mexican government held a lottery draw that included 20 properties seized from drug traffickers and corrupt politicians. Among the prizes was the house on Rio Humaya Street in Culiacan, the 2-bedroom, 2,800-square-foot property where Chapo had escaped through the bathtub tunnel on that February morning 7 years earlier. The surveillance cameras that had covered every angle of the house's exterior had been removed, but the hydraulic bathtub system remained intact, preserved as historical evidence of Chapo's ingenuity. Lottery tickets cost $12. A mystery winner received the property, though their identity was never disclosed, perhaps because owning El Chapo's safe house in Sinaloa might attract unwanted attention from remaining cartel members or from tourists hoping to see the infamous tunnel. The house stood as a monument to a criminal career that had spanned 3 decades, generated billions of dollars, corrupted countless officials, killed thousands of people, and supplied millions of Americans with the drugs they craved. What remains most striking about Chapo's property empire isn't just its scale, but what it reveals about the drug trade itself. Those 78 Colombian properties represented more than real estate. They represented the internationalization of drug trafficking, the networks that connected Colombian cocaine producers with Mexican smugglers and American distributors. They represented the corruption that allowed a foreign criminal to own dozens of properties in a country theoretically committed to fighting drug trafficking. They represented the money, the staggering amounts of money that flow through the cocaine trade. So much money that buying 78 properties was just one small part of managing Chapo's wealth. And they represented the futility of the war on drugs. Because even with Chapo in prison, even with his properties seized, the Sinaloa Cartel continues to operate under new leadership. His sons, Alfredo and Ivan, run significant portions of the organization. Ismael Zambada Garcia, known as El Mayo, another longtime cartel leader, continues to coordinate operations from hiding, never having been captured despite decades of law enforcement pursuit. Today, Chapo sits in a cell at ADX Florence in Colorado, the supermax prison where America houses its most dangerous criminals. He's confined 23 hours a day, allowed 1 hour of exercise in a small cage, permitted minimal contact with other humans. His wife, Emma Coronel, was arrested in 2021, pleaded guilty to drug trafficking and money laundering charges, and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. She was released in 2023. Their twin daughters are being raised by family members. Chapo's other children, some from previous marriages, some from relationships with mistresses, are scattered across Mexico. His Colombian properties sit in government hands, some sold at auction, some still tied up in legal proceedings, some simply abandoned. His Mexican properties have been dispersed, the Culiacan safe houses emptied and cleaned, the tunnels sealed, the surveillance systems dismantled. The $10 million Acapulco beach house with its private zoo has been seized, the animals relocated, the property awaiting auction or demolition. But the real estate doesn't matter anymore. What mattered was what those properties represented. A network that stretched from the Sierra Madre to the Caribbean coast, from Sinaloa to Colombia, from rural farms to urban penthouses. That network moved drugs and money and people, corrupted officials, financed violence, and generated wealth on a scale that most legitimate businesses can only dream about. Chapo's 78 Colombian properties were just nodes in that network, places where cocaine could be stored, or money could be laundered, or meetings could be held. Properties that blended into cities and countryside, hidden in plain sight, protected by shell companies and frontmen, and the knowledge that even if one property was seized, 77 others remained. The genius of Chapo's property strategy was its redundancy. Lose one safe house, rotate to another. Lose one tunnel, dig another. Lose one country, move to another. Always moving, always adapting, always staying one step ahead until the day the Marines finally broke through that water-filled steel door and found the bathtub rising on its hydraulic lift, revealing the tunnel beneath, the empty tunnel. Because Chapo was already gone, running through the sewers of Culiacan one more time, heading toward Mazatlan and the Hotel Miramar and apartment 401, where his luck finally ran out. The morning of February 16th, 2014, when that bathtub hatch opened and Chapo descended into the darkness, marked the beginning of the end for the most powerful drug trafficker in history. But that morning also revealed something profound about the nature of his empire. It wasn't built on violence alone, though violence was essential. It wasn't built on corruption alone, though corruption enabled everything. It was built on properties, on physical spaces scattered across 2 continents, on safe houses and mansions and farms and hotels. On the simple reality that to run a global drug trafficking operation, you need places to meet, places to store product, places to count money, places to hide. Chapo understood this from the beginning. The illiterate farm boy from La Tuna, who became a billionaire, did so by mastering not just the drug trade, but the real estate game that supported it. 78 properties in Colombia. 7 connected houses in Culiacan, ranches in every Mexican state, houses at every beach, a $10 million compound in Acapulco, properties hidden and dispersed and rotated and protected. An empire built not just on powder and pills, but on land and buildings and the tunnels that connected them. Tunnels that let him disappear again and again. Until finally, there were no more tunnels to run through, and no more hydraulic bathtubs to lift, and no more corrupt officials to warn him, and no more time. Just Marines shouting, and Emma Coronel screaming, "Don't kill him," and Chapo emerging from that bathroom in his underwear, hands extended, defeated at last, captured in apartment 401 of a building he didn't own in a city he'd thought was safe. Far from the Colombian properties he'd bought decades earlier, far from the Culiacan safe houses with their tunnels and their secrets, far from everything except the consequences that had been waiting for him since that day in 1992, when his gunmen massacred innocent people in a Puerto Vallarta disco and set in motion the events that would eventually lead him here, to this moment, this surrender, this end.